tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not only or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Hello, everyone. We have with us Professor Mridula Mukherjee, former director of Nehru Memorial and Museum Library. We would be talking about Nehru, our first Prime Minister, his legacy, and we would try to understand what Nehru really was, because as we know, 75 years from the independence, it seems that we don't really know him that well. There are various perceptions about Nehru's, but it seems that we have to go back to learning him again. So that this is one of those efforts. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for speaking to National Herald.
Welcome.
I will start with our first question. Like I said, that we are going to celebrate 75 years of independence. As a historian, of the modern contemporary times, how do you think Nehru should be remembered by the nation from here on?
Well, clearly there are two very clear, very distinct aspects to how we would have to remember Nehru. First, he would have to be remembered as a foremost freedom fighter. He was one of the tallest leaders of our freedom struggle. After Gandhiji, it is usually Jawaharlal Nehru's name that we take as among the most prominent leaders. That doesn't mean that there were not other very prominent leaders like Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, Maulana Azad, Kripalani of the later phase. But if we go back, then begin with Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Tilak. I mean, we had so many stalwarts that it is difficult to say who were primary. But I would certainly say that among those front rank of the leaders of the freedom struggle, Jawaharlal Nehru was certainly one. And since he played a very crucial role in the final phase, the mass phase of the freedom struggle under the leadership of Gandhiji from 1918-19 till 1947, those last 30 years. Therefore, obviously, in more recent history, his name would be coming up as among the foremost ones, right? Secondly, we have to remember him as the founder of the independent Indian state, the founder, the builder, the architect of India after independence. He was prime minister for a long time, He was prime minister for almost 17 years.
Yes.
And that's a long time at a very crucial period in India's history, just after becoming independent. In fact, even from a year before, he was heading the interim government, which was equal to the role of prime minister. Once Gandhiji died in January 1948, which was, just about 5 months after we got our independence, then Nehru's role becomes even more important. In another 3 years, Sardar Patel left us in 1950. And certainly he was a great support to Nehru and a co-builder of India after independence. Once he left, then Nehru's responsibility in a sense and his role becomes even larger in terms of being able to carry forward.
And in a way, he was also more alone in this endeavor.
Yes, that's why I said the responsibility on him became even, more heavier. Of course, Maulana Azad luckily was still there for another few years, till about 58. And and he had a very able cabinet. There's no doubt about that, because, we had extraordinary talent that came to build India after independence. Partly, they were all people who had come in through the freedom struggle. People like Govind Ballabh Pant, for example, who was in the cabinet at the center for a very long time. People of that kind of stature, extraordinary intellectual, by the way. And people of and also Nehru pulled in a lot of professional talent into the cabinet. So it was, he also he was not at all sectarian when it came to running the government. He brought in the best talent from wherever he thought. C.D. Deshmukh, for example, was a former ICS. John Mathai, the economist, finance minister after independence, he wasn't a freedom fighter. There were many people who came from different walks of life and contributed.
So domain experts he got.
Yes. So I would therefore, to summarize, we have to remember him as a freedom fighter, because often we forget that. People, I find, always talking about Prime Minister Nehru. During his prime ministership, he did that. Before that, for 30 years, he was mobilizing, he was out in the fields, he was out on the streets, he was out on the mohallas. For 9 years, he was in jail. Out of those 30 years that I'm talking about, for 9 years, he spent in jail.
9 years?
9 years, yes. He went to jail 9 or 10 times, and a total of 9 years was spent in jail. That's why he could write 3 brilliant books.
This is something definitely the modern generation do not understand and do not know, because there is so much of misinformation also spread. And we will talk about the misinformation later. But to summarize your point, he was a freedom fighter to begin with. And you're saying for 30 years, he has been a freedom fighter before he got to the power of the prime minister. Somehow it seems that everything was served to him on a platter, and he got everything easy. Somehow that is the impression. So we have to remember that. And then you said that he was the architect of modern India, the India as we know it today, or shall we say the India that we know by 2000s, by the 21st century. He was the architect. And that would bring me to my next question is, what do you think was the vision that he had for India? What was his core values and his dreams for India that he wanted to, he wanted to take India to that level at international stage? We were a poor country. We were a country that was viewed as backward and a land of snake charmers, and that kind of an image that Rajas and Maharajas walk about in elephants. That's all that the world knew about us. So what was the architect's dream for the India that he wanted to build, that he implemented in the next 17 years? So if you could give us about that vision, that dream, that value system.
Firstly, let me correct that impression, which has become popular later on, that, in the world thought of India as a land of snake charmers and all that. The world, when India was fighting for freedom, the world also saw India as one of the most prominent fighters for freedom in the world. In fact, it was understood that India was the leader of the colonial world against colonial oppression. And Indian freedom, Indian independence was understood to be the turning point for the end of colonialism in the whole world. So India was seen by Africa, by Southeast Asia, by other colonial countries as being the leader of the whole wave of anti-imperialist struggles for freedom. It was people would look up to India and say, what's happening here? When is India becoming independent? And it is true, India was the first country to gain independence from British colonial rule or any big colonial rule. And it is after that, from the 40s into the 50s and into the 60s, that the rest of Asia and Africa started to become slowly throw off the foreign yoke.
Right.
Okay. India's struggle for freedom was the first struggle to start.
I see.
Right in the third quarter of the 19th century. Intellectually also, the whole intellectual contribution of the Indian leadership, from Dadabhai Naoroji to Gokhale to Tilak, the whole first generation, of thinkers, Rana Day, R.C. Dutt, they were the ones who laid down the framework for understanding what is modern colonialism.
I see.
And it is on that basis that the struggle for freedom started in India. And then from India, you could say a lot of the ideas began to spread. Of course, there were other forces also in the world. I'm not saying that every country was imitating India or getting all their resources from India, but India was certainly in the forefront. In most other countries, even in China, for example, if you look at when their modern struggle for democracy and freedom from the different kinds of colonial powers which they had, you have to wait for another 30, 40 years, for that to begin in the second decade, Sun Yat-sen and all that, second decade of the 20th century. In India, Dadabhai Naoroji's ideas, for example, we are talking about the 1870s. And in fact, more recent research has shown that in Maharashtra, even before the revolt of 1857, in the 1840s itself, some of these new ideas about understanding the true nature of colonial rule had already come out.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
So for Jawaharlal Nehru,
his vision,
it was not that he had to establish India, in the world. India was the leader of the colonial world already.
Right.
Indian publicists had spread this in the US, for example. Lala Lajpat Rai had gone for a tour in the second decade.
Right.
And spread these ideas. So many publicists used to go, leaders used to go, messages, people used to read books about India and all that. So I would say in the aware part of the world, the politically conscious part of the world, India also had that image. Gandhi was very well known, so it was not only an image of snake charmers and this thing. All right. Yes, India did become independent as a very poor country. 200 and more years ravaged by colonialism. From a very rich country, we had become a very poor country.
Right.
So yes, Jawaharlal Nehru had his work cut out for him. And the other thing was that as far as what his dream was, what his vision was, the first question you asked was, in the world. Now, I think Jawaharlal Nehru was very clear that just because you were poor didn't mean that you were not wise,
right,
or that you did not have anything to offer to the world in terms of a vision. So he never thought that India's poverty or its being an underdeveloped country in any way was a constraint in being able to express India's ideas to the world. In fact, some people do criticize also and say, big talk, but without substance. But that's not how it was seen. India, even in the late 40s and early 50s, you would be surprised to see, played the role of peacekeeper in the world. It was very active in the UN forces that were sent anywhere. India played a role in negotiations between the big powers in Korea, in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. So India was playing a role in international diplomacy which it is not playing today, despite the fact that we are now so much more powerful, so much richer. So I think this notion that, if you become a developed country necessarily, or more developed, necessarily your voice will count for more. No, it's a question of how you play the role and what role you play. Are you playing a role even? For
Right.
example, today the Israel-Palestine conflict is going on.
Yeah.
India is silent.
Silent.
Why? I cannot imagine such a thing happening if Nehru was around. India had a voice. It had an opinion despite being poor.
So you're saying it had a thought. India was
our
already
people may be poor. Even the poorest of our people are very wise.
wise.
Wisdom and wealth do not necessarily go together.
Right. So you're saying India was already a Vishwa Guru in that sense. We're already a thought leader.
We did not have, no, it was not Vishwa Guru.
Okay.
We thought of ourselves as equal to everybody else.
Equal.
We didn't think ourselves as superior.
Right.
Jawaharlal Nehru would be the last
Amazing.
person to want to be superior. Why? Every country has the right to their own dignity, their own position in the world. We want to be equal. We don't want to talk down to people, but we are certainly willing to give advice and play a role where we can. And certainly, he thought India had something to offer to the world, its ancient wisdom, its whole history, its rich experience as a people, as a state. After all, state formation in India took place, very, very early on. So if we have such a rich history, obviously we have something to offer to the world. But that doesn't mean it is superior to others,
Right. No, that's a very beautiful way of putting it, that there is no need to be Vishwa Guru, but we were equals.
Yes.
And you're saying that
why everybody in the world wants to, live the life their own way, their own culture, their own way. Who are we to tell the world how to live? The Chinese have an old civilization.
Absolutely.
Egypt has an old civilization. Mesopotamia, Iraq, all these places had civilizations which are as old as Indian. Greek civilization, why, even in terms of, you're just talking in terms of antiquity, how does India become superior? I don't understand this obsession with wanting to be superior, wanting to be older than everybody. We are old enough. It's okay. It's quite enough.
So, like you just said, that today's situation with Palestine and Israel, and we are quiet, we don't have a voice. What are these values that we have lost over the time, that you would think that Nehru's cherished values?
One standing up for the oppressed, standing up for the underdog. So in international relations, India's voice would always be with those who were being oppressed. Let me give you an example. South Africa. Why does South Africa even today have such regard for India? Because at a time when nobody was willing to support the struggle of the Black people in South Africa, nobody was willing to condemn South Africa. India did. India did it when it had no power. It was a poor country. But India did it right in the 40s and 50s. India stood with South Africa from then on. So it's a question of moral stand.
Moral stand.
That was from Gandhi. Nehru was a Gandhian in that way. He believed very much in a moral position, whether it was in India or it was in the world. So I think that was very important. Then the belief in non-violence, the belief in peace, that the objective of world diplomacy has to be peace. The message coming out of the two world wars which had devastated the world. Don't forget, when India becomes independent, the Second World War has just ended.
Yeah.
The world is just still recovering. Think of Europe at that time. Europe is devastated. Millions have died. Millions. 20 million died in the Soviet Union. Just remember that, in one country. And the Marshall Plan had to be put in place in order to rebuild Europe. They were rationing still going on in Britain, not enough food to eat. No, so when that was the stage, and so the objective of the new arrangements which he hoped the world would now move towards under the aegis of the United Nations and all that, in which he hoped that India would play a big role, and he was always at the forefront to play a big role, would be the objective would be world peace. So he put, again following Gandhi, when the atom bomb was thrown, Gandhiji's reaction was that I am even more convinced that the world needs non-violence. Atom bomb has not convinced me of the necessity of violence. It has convinced me of the opposite.
Right.
And Nehru made that his mission in life, to work for peace, world peace.
World peace.
Yeah. So that there, India's voice was always there for world peace, to bring about negotiated settlements between countries, to try and reduce conflict, to support the colonial countries in their struggles for freedom. That is how the whole idea of non-alignment comes about.
Exactly. Right.
Unhappily for Nehru, the world got divided into two blocks after the end of the Second World War. The Soviet-led bloc and the US-led bloc, or the Western-led bloc. And Nehru was very clear that India was not going to become a junior partner or a cog in some bloc. We had not become independent to now become subservient again.
Exactly.
So we wanted our own voice. And that is why the concept of non-alignment. And as you know, you're aware of how that idea grew over time. It took time. But and more people came round to it. Initially, it was Nasser in Egypt and Yugoslavia, Tito, Marshal Tito.
Yeah.
These were the two big supporters. But Indonesia, Ceylon, various places, meetings were held, conferences were held, and finally a non-aligned
movement
was set up in 61 in Belgrade. And that was and it is an idea which has lasted.
Yes, absolutely.
And more countries, as they came out of the colonial yoke, joined non-aligned bloc, because they all had the same imperative as India, the same feeling. We have not become independent to become subservient again.
To one big brother. We didn't want to become subservient to either of the big brothers.
That's
so we wanted to have our independent voice in the world.
Right.
And that's why
it took a while for people to appreciate it. I mean, initially, even, of course, the US didn't like it at all.
Yeah. I think it is also incredibly brave of smaller nations to decide to stay independent of either of the factions, either of the blocks.
But the fact that you could now form a third bloc, which was the non-aligned bloc.
Non-aligned bloc.
It was a bloc, but a non-aligned bloc.
Very.
That was a very interesting concept.
And it has
many countries joined, and of course, Indira Gandhi took it forward.
Yeah, and it has survived till date.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So you're saying you're saying this is one of the values that we have lost, that we are no longer being that speaking for the oppressed.
Yes,
and
we are. It seems to me that we do not have such a clear-cut voice in world affairs.
Diplomacy, world
Okay. And India is like, as I said, it was looked up to as somebody who would take a moral position. I think that has somewhere
that kind of has been
right. We have tended to move closer to certain countries more than necessary. No.
Right.
And thereby, I think, sacrifice some of our independence. Though I think the basic thrust of Indian foreign policy, I think the non-aligned thrust is still strong enough for us not to become totally aligned with any bloc. No, because there is a certain structural reason why we are non-aligned.
Right.
But I think it has weakened. That impulse has weakened. and
Right.
that's not a good thing. And our ability to speak up in the world has weakened.
Okay. So we'll come back to that again. But let's talk about the 17 years that Nehru was the prime
Yes.
minister.